So I am Mike Munoz, the District Ranger with the Forest Service on the Rocky Mountain District of the Helena, Lewis, and Clark National Forest. And I get to moderate today's webinar that the Crown Managers Partnership is putting on. And the reason that we're having this webinar is to primarily focus on the 2021 fire season. We had our March fire forum for the Crown Managers earlier this year, and there are a lot of our participants were really interested in having a follow-up to see what went on with this fire season, to see what type of outcomes resulted, or if there are any policy considerations that changed, or to see if there's any simple reflections that folks would like to share. And so as a result of that, we are also releasing our summary report from the Fire Forum of 2021. And all of you as registrants received that from Natalie, who's the brains of this whole Zoom meeting. So she'll keep us going no matter what. But you received that. It's a summary report, but you can go to the crownmanagers.org, crownmanagers, all one word, .org, and you can see the live presentations of the numerous folks we had over the 5 days of that particular forum that we had virtually or held virtually. And it was one of the first times we held a virtual Crown Forum. Usually they are in person and we rotate them throughout Alberta, British Columbia, and Montana. So the really interesting thing on this particular webinar is that about half the participants participated in the forum in March, and the other half are essentially new to the Crown experience, I guess, and which is really cool. It's nice to know that we're getting out there and getting some folks to take a look at what we have and what we've been doing for the last 21 years, essentially. On our agenda today, we'll have 3 guest speakers, and we'll be giving them 10 minutes and then 5 minutes of questions. And we can be flexible on that if necessary, but we do want to end by 1:30. We're going from 12 to 1:30 essentially today. And we'll be watching for hands and looking at the chat. Natalie and I have worked that out to see if we can get those questions out there for our speakers to engage in. So, one thing I wanted to do real quick was, oh, I forgot, there's more to the agenda. After that, we decided that we really want to get folks involved in discussions. And one of the best ways we thought we could do that was have a map of our 18 million acre Crown of the Continent Crown Managers Partnership area displayed with the fires that occurred throughout the Crown in this 2021 season. And maybe have some folks tell some stories about some of their involvement with those fires or some of their knowledge of those fires. And so we plan on spending about 20 to 25 minutes doing that and then wrapping up when we're done. So one of the things I wanted to do to just kind of kick things off before we turn it over to our speakers and introduce them individually was just let you know that it was with great anticipation that I entered the 2021 fire season after our forum. And it was with great anticipation for some opportunities. We take a lot of opportunities to manage fire for benefit here within the Bob Marshall complex. And lo and behold, even during our forum, which was held the last week of March, the Blackfeet Reservation already had a fire called the Greenhouse Fire that went to nearly 20,000 acres at the end of March. And just as soon as it began, it was about over with in terms of snowstorms that came in. We sent resources to help and had to turn folks around because they couldn't travel up the highway. But despite that, it was something that I was looking forward to, even to the point where I got invited to talk to Wild Montana. And the title of my talk was Wise Designs Through All Generations, much like considering the management or the activities that we do and thinking about things out to the 7th generation, not simply the here and now. And so with the greenhouse fire, I waited, not just I, but my folks that work with me and the rest of the forest, we waited and waited and waited. And within the Bob Marshall complex, nothing seemed to be happening. And that all changed. And I'll save the rest of that story for story time and when we take a look at some maps. So with that, I'd like to go ahead and move on to introducing our speakers. We're going to have Ron Swaney and Bill Avey and Matt Rance in that order. And we'll get kicked off here with an introduction of Ron Swaney. Ron is the Fire Management Officer for the Confederated Salish and Kootenai tribes on the Flathead Indian Reservation of Western Montana. Ron started his fire career in 1984. He was a part of the Mission Valley, El Carrizo, and Dalton Hotshots. He also spent a couple of years on the Muscalera Apache Reservation working in timber sales. Ron served as the fuel officer for the Confederated Salish Kootenai tribe for a decade before becoming the tribe's fire management officer in 2013. So with that, Ron, I'll turn it over to you. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Mike. I'll try to share my screen and go through a PowerPoint presentation from my perspective of the 2021 fire season. Are you able to see that, Mike?
Yep, we see it.
Yes, coming across great.
So I was asked to answer 3 questions with my presentation. Is one, what made 2021 different from previous years? 2, what was successful and what we had hoped to replicate in future years? And number 3, going forward, what should people know? And kick into that presentation right now. So I am the Fire Management Officer for the Confederated Salish Kootenai Tribes Division of Fire. I've had the pleasure of serving our tribes since 2013 in that capacity. And although, looking at the numbers, statistically, 2021 was no different than any other year. We had, 70 fires, burned 7,518 acres, but there were 4 fires that escaped initial attack. The first one was in April, fire that jumped the Flathead River and gave us some fits. Another one that we received is Little Money 2, a lightning caused fire early in July. But the fires I want to talk about, I'll start with the Boulder 2700 fire. This is a person caused fire on the east shore of Flathead Lake in the Highway 35 corridor. Reported on July 31st, which just happened to be the hottest day of the year in Kalispell, Montana. It was reported about 2:30, 3 a.m. in the morning. The fire was dozer lined at about 80 acres, 17 and a half hours later. So about 22:30 or 20-30 hours, we had that fire lined with dozer at about 80 acres in size. The fire behavior when we lined the fire was minimal. Winds were calm. The sun was setting, and we felt pretty good about our position. And suddenly everything switched, and a strong east wind, warm east wind, surfaced on the fire. The fire blew up and charged downhill towards Highway 93, the utility infrastructure and homes. And we quickly went into structure protection. Here's a picture of a couple of our guys setting up on a structure. The first ones we set up on, we got ran over really hard by this fire, and it was scramble mode. It was really Western. The fire behavior was erratic. There was group torching, crown fire, frequent spotting, and an ember shower that came down upon us, caused by that torching and crown fire activity. It was we were pretty much used. It was very tough, very challenging fire environment. Firefighter safety was definitely a concern of ours, and trying to protect structures. When the sun rose, the wind started to go back uphill and provided some relief, at least around the structures, but we still had about 2 miles of wildland urban interface that had active fire inside of it. So we had quite a task ahead of us trying to, secure things and get things in order. The response that night was amazing from the Lake County rural fire departments, Lake County OEM, the sheriff's department. We quickly closed down Highway 35. We evacuated a large area, including Finley Point. Shut off power to that piece of country with Mission Valley Power. They came in and shut down all the power to provide at least a reasonably safe working environment for our firefighters. At about 2,000 hours on the first, Rick Connell's incident management team took over control of the fire and gave our folks some rest. It was about a 42-hour shift, a very heroic effort by the responders, and quite an eye-opener, just how devastating that type of fire was and how quickly it became that. And our hearts go out to those that lost structures. We gave everything we could to try to protect them. Sincere thanks to Rick and his team for taking that fire over and giving us an opportunity to get some rest. This is a map from Rick's team. You can see along the lake shore there, the amount of homes that were impacted by that fire run. It pushed downhill and to the north relentlessly till about 5 o'clock in the morning, and finally turned and went up slope. When we got Rick's incident management team in place and they started ordering resources, there were a lot of UTFs, just not a lot of resources available. And although we were the #1 priority in the nation, we'd already lost, close to 30 structures. We couldn't get resources. And the Northern Rockies gave us a task force to try to stand us up, 2 hotshot crews, a dozer, and a Type 6 engine. But, just an amazing amount of work needed for this fire and very limited resources. So we asked Rick's team to ensure that we didn't lose any other structures, to focus in on mopping up around the structures that survived, put a lot of effort into safing out Highway 35, trying to get the infrastructure back into place, get the utility lines back up and operating, to get power back to that area, and then slowly and strategically lifted the area closures to allow people to come back into their homes to take care of their things. And quite an experience. It's a fire that's going to live with me for the remainder of my career, for sure. And I'm sure we'll have some more discussion on this fire, but that's the Boulder 2700 fire. The other fire that we had that was significant, and I feel I should talk to folks about, is the Crooks fire. The Crooks fire was initially attacked with 27 people. The fire is a lightning caused fire that initiated in the South Fork primitive area, an area that the tribes have set aside for cultural and spiritual use for tribal members. The area has seen no active management since the 70s. And the last significant fire that I could see before 2003 was in 1950. This area has seen a lot of insects and disease have impacted the lodgepole pine and obviously the Douglas fir. There's a fair amount of root rot and other things going on, and the stands are starting to fall apart, as you can see from the fuel load on the surface. And another huge concern for us was the snags that were present within the fire area. This fire made a pretty active push towards the people that we had on the fire. One night, it burned active in a thermal belt, and it was decided that we needed to extract those folks as quickly as we could. We relied heavily on our interagency partners, the Lolo National Forest and Thorn Fire. Scott Shrink sent us a heavy helicopter to help contain the fire and keep it in check, while the Lolo sent up their initial attack helicopter to help shuttle people out with our helicopter. Once we had everyone secure, we had a fire on the landscape that was going to be there for some time, and yippee, you know, and anyone that's ever managed one of these knows kind of what I'm talking about. These things take on a life of their own, and this is the Crooks fire. This is after that wind event that blew out the Boulder 2700 fire. You can see that this fire pushed pretty hard back towards the west with that east wind towards the community of Arlee. And there were some fingers that established to the north of this fire, you know, these long fingers that just established and became available for large runs. Fires in this area, this is the Liberty Fire of 2017. We also had the Jocko Lakes Fire of 2007, the Mineral Prim Fire of 2003, and the White Horse Fire of 2013. This is a complex fuel type, and once it gets things aligned with atmospheric stability, wind, relative humidities, Haynes index, these things have had a tendency to run hard. And this is the Liberty running off the reservation. The Crooks also had that dimension. This is the Crooks fire taken from a picture taken from Arlee, Montana, and looking at it taking a run. Something about these types of fires, you know, these big box, I call them the big box theory. When we can't engage them, you know, we try to find the next opportunity where we can. And that's that black line. That was the box that we put around the Crooks. You know, a lot of interagency discussion, a lot of concern, definitely with Seeley Lake and Placid Lake, the state of Montana, Lolo National Forest about this fire. And we lived with it for approximately 50 days. And this is the final fire size. It stayed within the box, thank goodness. But quite an experience, again, for our program. A lot of management activities. Building the box creates a lot of slash disposal became an issue. Maintaining oversight with the shortage of resources nationally was also a huge concern for us. And we just rotated people in and out of this fire through most of the fire season. You know, reflecting back on 2021, things that I would like to repeat, you know, one, I'd like to tip my hat to everyone that came and helped us with the 2021 fire season. We rolled pretty hard here on the reservation, and we had very little injuries. I mean, we had a couple minor falls and trips and stumbles, but all in all, everything went very well in terms of safety of our firefighters, and bringing home everyone safe is something, you know, certainly I hope to replicate from here on out. Another thing is the collaboration with our interagency partners. We had a lot of help from the state of Montana, both the Southwest and Northwest Land Office, Flathead, Lolo, Bitterroot National Forests, Lake County Rural Fire Departments, Sanders County Dispatch, Lake County Dispatch, Missoula Interagency Dispatch Center. And another piece to our puzzle here on the reservation is the severity resources that we bring in to assist. And that's the Eastern Oklahoma region, Southern Plains region, Navajo region, and the Tongass National Forest. All of these people we've had a strong relationship with over the years. A lot of these folks spent 60 days on the reservation helping us deal with the Boulder 2700, the Crooks fire, and also our initial attack. And I hope that we can maintain that relationship and make it stronger going forward. What I'd like to tell...
Hey, Ron, this is Mike. We have about 2 to 3 more minutes to wrap up, so we have time for questions.
Yes, sir. This will be the last slide. You know, just looking forward, what I would want to tell folks, what people should know is fire activity is on the increase nationally. This is our statistics looking from 78 to 97, from 98 to 2017. A dramatic increase in fire activity. I don't know if it's climate change or the cumulative effects of fire suppression, but we definitely have a fuels issue. We definitely have a wildland urban interface issue. And I'm not a mad scientist. I'm not sure exactly what is going on, but I do know one. His name's Matt Jolly, and Jolly told me, you know, what we need to look at is, you know, 98% of the time we're going to catch fires. And when we look at risk, I think we need to look at that 2%. That 2% of the weather periods that align with fuels and account for 90% of the acres burned. And when I start looking at our wildland urban interface and areas of concern, it has grown exponentially since the Boulder 2700 fire. There's a lot of homes there that I would have thought we would have been able to protect, but under those extreme weather conditions, it was very hard to protect or save everyone. And the fuels problem is huge. I think we need to do more fuels work. I think we need to subsidize logging so that more fuel work and more logging gets completed, as treating all the spectrums of the fire environment, of the fuel environment, from the crown fire potential to the surface fire is very important. Everything that we learned in S215 is true. You know, defensible space, construction materials, roading, everything comes into play when a fire starts to roll down into the urban interface. And to provide us with an opportunity to protect all our high value resources, I think we need to increase our fuels treatment exponentially. I think there should be at some level some grants or something available to folks that reside in this wildland urban interface, because the issue is too big. And for us to be effective, we need all hands on deck. And that means allowing or providing those folks an opportunity to create a defensible space. And that will be the end of my presentation, and thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Ron. Those were some pretty active fires. And I think one of the first questions I had, especially with you presenting the statistics on fires that you took active suppression on, were any of those fires, the wildfires, in vicinity of any prescribed fires or thinning that the tribe did on the reservation?
Yeah, that's a great question. We did have some successes. We had a fire called the Finley Fire that made a pretty good run one afternoon and bumped into a fuels treatment that we had implemented right behind the tribal housing community of Shalai. And it was effective in slowing and stopping that fire and providing us an opportunity, or we would have had another escape fire on our hands. We have had some successes in the past of fires burning into fuels treatments. You know, the 2018 Garden Creek fire is one of those. The Chippy Creek fire 2007 bumped into a fuels treatment and the fuels treatment stood up very well. We've had some successes. Definitely.
Okay, that's good to know. So we have two questions in the chat. I'm going to start with the one that was asked last. It said, noticing that UTFs were in the hundreds at times this year, what advice do you have for getting through an incident with limited resources?
You know, the advice I would have, you know, I don't know. We were told, well, we had to do more with less this year. You definitely have to strategically align the resources with what you can do. Like with Rick's crew, with Rick's team, instead of attacking the fire and going up and lining it, Rick's team moved north and south, trying to build a defensible space around the remaining structures, knowing that he didn't have enough horsepower to go uphill and contain the fire where it was at. Again, it was more of a box strategy. It really wasn't initial, direct attack, anchor, or flank. It was just providing us with an opportunity to be successful to protect homes, knowing that that fire was going to be able to move up slope. Communicating with your interagency partners. I mean, that fire, we had a lot of discussions with Flathead National Forest and state of Montana, just where this fire had the potential to go to, and start planning ahead of time of if it does go to that location, how we're going to cooperate together, coordinate together to try to be successful.
Yeah, it was a great question on the UTF, and it's good that you have some ideas on how to address that. But one of the remarkable things that happened in the U.S. this year was that our preparedness level, and there's a preparedness level of 1 to 5, 1 being you have a whole lot of resources available, and 5 being that you're essentially none. We actually hit preparedness level 5, the earliest ever in the U.S. on July 4th, starting preparedness level 5, not having resources available for assignments, and therefore a lot of UTFs. And it actually lasted 99 days, which is another record. Earliest and the longest in terms of having multiple fire events and not able to have the resources they needed. So one more question here in the chat, and Natalie, if you have anyone with a hand up, I'll read this next question. It has more to do with resources following the fire event. Any concerns already regarding surrounding water quality in freshwater bodies?
No, I don't have concerns that way. We did have a bear team come in and look at the erosion potential and the potential of impacting the homes that did survive the Boulder fire. We really do have some concerns with that Highway 35 corridor going forward. We've had discussions with the National Weather Service. We're going to set up a RAW station and try to get some information out to those that reside in that area about the risks that still exist. Another thing with climate, with the change in climate, the wind profile that we've seen here, a lot of east winds. Now, when they come with a lot of strength. And we've had some blowdown in that area around Finley Point and Highway 35 over the last, I don't know, 10 years. And last year we had 3 events that were significant. And now with all those snags that are looming up above that highway, we do have some real concerns with that as well. So although the fire's out, we still have a lot of management activities going on, a lot of coordination, a lot of concern with that fire in particular.
All right. I'm going to wrap up this session here. Really appreciate it, Ron. There is another thought in the chat, and I'll let you take a look at that. And I hope you're sticking around for later conversations afterwards when we get to the story time.
Yes, sir.
Thank you again. And so I say that about sticking around. Bill Avey's our next speaker, and he's been around a bit. But he's only able to be on the call with us today until 1300 or 1 p.m. Mountain Standard Time. And so I just wanted to let folks know that ahead of time. But Bill, I have to full disclosure, he's my forest supervisor here on the Helena, Lewis, and Clark forests. So he might get a few extra minutes here and there. We'll see. Anyways, Bill began his career with the USDA Forest in Wyoming on the Bighorn National Forest in 1981. And skipping ahead quite a bit, from 2000 to 2010, he was a district ranger on the Big Timber and Livingston Ranger districts on the Gallatin National Forest, which is now the Custer Gallatin. A lot of combinations happening on forest down here. He became deputy director of fire, aviation, and air for the northern region in 2010, which covers all of Montana, North Dakota, and part of South Dakota, and then the panhandle of the state of Idaho. In February 2012, he was appointed as the forest supervisor of the Lewis and Clark National Forest. And then again, the Lewis and Clark combined with the Helena, and he became the forest supervisor of 2 combined forests, which is now known as the Helena, Lewis, and Clark. And in June of this year, Bill took on a role that he was asked by the chief of the Forest Service to serve as the acting director of fire aviation management for the agency. Bill and his wife, Crystal, reside in Helena and have 2 adult daughters. And I'll hand it over to you, Bill.
Thank you, my friend. Thanks, Mike. Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for tuning in. So as I was listening to Ron, I was struck by my talk is going to carry some of the same points from a much different scale. And what I'm really going to talk about this year is my experience as our National Director of Fire and Aviation Management during really the heat of this year's fire year. A couple of things I want to touch on first is we entered into the 21 fire year tired from the 2020 fire year. And I am being very deliberative when I say fire year and not fire seasons. We don't have fire seasons anymore. We have fire years across the nation. Our fire response personnel are working pretty much year round anymore. And yet we have a employment model across the federal agencies and the state agencies and our contract partners that was built and still reflects a seasonal or fire season reality that is simply no longer the reality. So that's one issue that nationally we need to fix, and we need to fix it fast. Our folks walked into this year tired. Many of our folks didn't get much of a break at the end of 2020. And then a lot of our fire suppression, fire response personnel and suppression resources were active in the COVID vaccination campaign. So they just got right off, fire duty and then went into multiple weeks of assisting with COVID vaccinations across the country as well. And then we started our active part of the 21 year down in the Southwest fairly early this year. As Mike touched on, we were at record level of what we call preparedness level 5 here in the States, also preparedness level 4. As of June 1st, when we looked at the predictive services forecast for the next 4 months of the fire year, every Western GAC was showing extreme fire behavior forecasted, and we had never seen that before. And by GAC, I mean geographic area. So Northern Rockies, Montana, Idaho, California, Oregon, Washington, Colorado, New Mexico, everybody lit up at the same time. And that's the way the year played out for us. But in addition, the Midwest lit up as well. We had fire in August and September in the Boundary Waters canoe area in northern Minnesota, which is somewhat unheard of to have large fires there. And certainly our friends in Canada had very much the same issues going on. So I want to point out that, again, I drive back my point home is that we're really living to some degree with a fire response, a resource perspective, back to the question on UTFs that was built on a model that is no longer practicable in the fire years that we have. We have a fire response system here in the United States, which is, provides what we're funded for. For the Forest Service, that's about 10,000 firefighters, about another 2,000 fire leadership. Department of Interior agencies, that's about 5,000 firefighters, and plus probably about 1,000 leadership for those agencies. And then states across the board, from everything from CAL FIRE, which essentially mirrors the Forest Service in many ways, to other states that have a very, very limited fire response personnel system. But, again, our response system this year was simply not funded up to the task of what we were dealing with, given the activity that occurred across the Western United States and Canada, all at the same time. So we found ourselves, as we walked through things, really moving this nationally, back to Ron's point, really as, I don't like to use war analogies, but I would use it for this one as a war of maneuver and not of attrition. And I think one of the things we saw is that strategies where folks had used previously, and agency cultures had used previously, of what I would call a full perimeter control suppression approach, did not work. CAL FIRE, not to single them out, but I would point out the Dixie Fire, which ended up being almost 1 million acres, was originally a CAL FIRE fire, which the full perimeter control suppression strategy started on, I believe, private land. CAL FIRE hit it with everything they had, just got up and walked right through those lines, ended up burning up most of the Plumas and Lassen National Forests, as well as the town of Greenville, and seriously impacted several other communities. And I think what we're seeing here is really the effect of climate change and its long-term effects on fuels. And it goes back to the point Ron made, is we need to be much more strategic as we have these fires about what our opportunities for actually addressing them are. I'll use the Dixie Fire again as an example. The only places we saw much success in holding the Dixie Fire are areas where we had done previous fuels treatment, including thinning and burning. So in the scenario we're seeing, that's the way this year played out. And I'll give you another example of that. Both the Dixie Fire and the Caldor Fire this year crossed and burned across the tops of the Sierras in California. That's the first time that's ever happened. Never seen that before. We've never seen the amount of pyrocumulus events, or the large, fire clouds, if you will. We would see, beginning in my experience now, you would occasionally see them in the early 2000s. I remember we had one on a Derby fire at Big Timber in 2006. This year they were popping up all over. We had multiple ones across the nation. And so it tells you, we're in a different scenario than historically we have been, and we've got to change as a society. And then certainly as individuals, our response to the situation we find ourselves in. The Caldor Fire, we were looking at projections for that fire as it burned across Echo Summit and started to come down into the South Lake Tahoe area. we were estimating probably a loss of about 17,790 structures, I believe. And so nationally, we were moving resources there to protect those structures as much as we could. But really what saved South Lake Tahoe and what got us through that without that loss was the effective fuels reduction treatments, right? Really on the edge of South Lake Tahoe, and the Caldor fire backed into those treatments and then really slowed down, got on the ground, and it allowed the resources that we had pulled off Dixie, pulled up from Southern California, and really across the rest of the nation to try to protect all of that large values at risk, enabled them to do some good work and hold that fire in place. We used analytics this year across the nation more so than we ever had before. And again, that really informed our national strategic decisions and allowed us to move resources around in a way that we had never done them before. And I want to touch base, Ron talked about the task force of strike team leaders, or excuse me, of hotshot crews and some dozers and skidgens that showed up. We were doing that across the country in what we called mobile reserves. Really, instead of assigning those resources to a particular fire, which has been our traditional way we've done it for a 2-week or 3-week period, we pulled some resources back out of the system and used those basically as a mobile reserve to do good where they needed to do good, then moved them on to the next incident. And it really paid off for us this year. But that being said, one of my takeaways is we need a lot more rest in our fire response system. This year, the Forest Service, we came out with direction in late June to move to a 14 and 3, 14 days on, 3 days of rest. It had been 14 and 2. And that is going to stay with us into the out years. We planned it. That is now our national policy. We did that just to try to get our folks through the year. But the reality is we need more response, and I'll speak to fuels treatment and other work in a minute, resources, not so much because we need to put, or not so much because it allows more resources applied to the fire, but to give our folks rest. And recently, our deputy chief for state and private sent a letter out directing us to move to a model of our type 1 or hotshot crews. They've always been 20-person hotshot crews. Now we're going to hire 25 with the intent of providing rest so people can get some time off, some days off during the course of the summer. One of the things we're seeing this year, and I read about it in the paper, is folks are leaving fire positions across all of the federal agencies, many of the state agencies as well, for higher paying positions. Part of it is pay. And I think you saw President Biden address that, to start to address that with the initiative here at the end of June related to firefighter pay and the retention and incentive bonuses that the federal agencies provided. But the other thing is work-life balance. I mean, people were getting just ground into the dirt. I don't know how else to say it through the course of this year. By October 1st, we were going to lose 45% of our hotshot crews. They were timing out. And even though we had provided money to keep them on, some incentives to keep them on, folks were just, I'm worn out, I'm done. So, you know, one of the things we dealt with through the nationally this year that we'd never dealt with before was this general labor shortage. And it wasn't just agency personnel, also our contract crews. We had the funding to hire about 260 what I call type 2 contract crews. At most, we could only find enough people, the contractors could only find enough people to put about 170 out on the table. So that's 90 less than what we had, and it's a 20-person crew, that's 1,800 people. 1,800 firefighters we didn't have through the course of the year. So you are seeing now that being discussed. It's a part of the infrastructure package that was passed here in the United States, was additional dollars for firefighter pay, a new firefighter series to try to address that, or fire responder series, excuse me. The other thing we dealt with this year that we never dealt with before was some supply chain issues. issues, much of the supply chain issues that you're hearing about related to, in the news media about whether or not things are going to be available for Christmas, for example, products, really played out as we addressed, supporting our fire responders in the field across all agencies this year. We struggled at times to ensure that we had aviation gas for aviation resources, for example, aviation fuel. Due to shortages, not so much in the fuel itself, but in the trucking to get it, particularly to some of our regional rural airports. Additionally, we had real issues with food. At one point, we were totally tapped out with caterers and our shower providers for our fire camps. And so we ended up actually doing a partnership with the Agricultural Marketing Service. I always thought they were just the people that like stockpile cheese and dairy products, but turns out they do a lot more than that. And they were able to get us help in the supply chain issues. So there was a lot of efforts going through in the background this year of things we hadn't done before. And we learned to do business in some very different ways and some very helpful ways. The other thing that we did working with our states was we brought the National Guard in for many more support roles, not just being on the line, but really a lot of security roles, a lot of driving roles, a lot of logistic roles in ways that they had not been used before. So those were all successes, but those were all issues created by the necessity of the scale of the fire year that we've been facing. So I think as a result of that, I would speak to a couple of things. One, it was interesting to me sitting in that role, the political establishment here in the United States woke up. And I would even offer in Canada, I do know there was a conversation, I believe, that was reported to me between the Prime Minister and the President about, the need, the fire seasons that both countries were having, and the need to ensure that we had enough fire response resources to cooperatively help each other. Now, at one point, we were helping Ontario with some of their fires, but this year we were so tapped out, we couldn't provide the traditional help that we provided for Canada and vice versa in many respects. Because everybody, again, Canada was experiencing much the same situation we were seeing. So I think there's recognition in the political establishments of both countries of the need, what climate change has done, and the need for us to react differently.
One more minute.
Okay, I'll finish up, Mike. Thank you for keeping me honest. The last thing I want to talk about is the path ahead. And the real path ahead is fuels treatment. Ron touched on it. The infrastructure package that recently was passed here in the United States really speaks to, and it's going to be implementing for us a 10-year strategy of the Forest Service of treating fuels, not just on national forests, but also on other jurisdictions, private lands. We estimated in the Western United States, we need to treat about 20 million acres on national forests and about 30 million acres of other jurisdictions to make a difference. Our way out of the fire year that we're in is simply having more fuels treatment on the landscape. The response structure we're in right now, we're having to respond to is simply not socially, ecologically sustainable. And our path out of that is doing work ahead of the fires, much like how Ron described, based on prioritized areas. First one being where we have high degree of wildfire risk transmission to communities, but also moving down that pike, doing similar to what's been done in the Bob Marshall area of ensuring that we have a resilient, fire resilient landscape. So both the use of fire, both thinning where it's appropriate. That's where we're headed on the Forest Service. And with that, Mike, I'll give you about your 5 seconds back.
Thank you for that. Thank you for providing that perspective that helps build on what Ron shared earlier. Really appreciate it. I have a question in the chat, and then I'll see if I get another, or I'll pose one to you about fuels. But this one, I'll read it. In terms of the effectiveness of the wildfire early detection and monitoring, do you see any gaps in the existing system of wildfire monitoring? And if yes, how they can be addressed technologically, taking into account rapid increase in extreme fire events across the US and Canada?
I think, to answer To answer your question, I think the biggest gap I see is not so much in the technology, but in the human species' ability to accept the facts in front of it. We have the technology where I'm using the technology widely from a detection perspective. I think the larger issue is both those of us in the fire business and the fire profession changing the slides. For myself, over 40 years of experience now, these fires are acting differently. Climate change has changed this. I can't use the experiences I had in the 1980s to think about strategies effectively to deal with these fires today. But I think larger is a larger population, the understanding of our countries and our larger populace, about where we're developing housing, what those actual risks are, and what we can actually expect fire response personnel to do. I think there is a unrealistic expectation on the part of the general public that the fire response system can save them, and that is a totally unrealistic expectation. And personally, I believe it's caused a number of funerals of firefighters over the years because of the expectation that they take on.
I didn't realize I was muted. Another question in the chat. Mobile ready reserves. Is this a model that is going to be adopted as policy? I see a lot of potential.
Yeah, thank you. It has been. It actually has been for years. I think this year is the first year we used it. It was as widely used and widely accepted, and part of that was what all of us saw with the predictive services forecast. I think back to the technology question, what's really improved is our ability to use analytics to predict where to put them.
So one question I want to pose real quick, and then I'll get to another one in the chat. Hearing a lot more about how we're preparing to do more fuels, obviously it's going to take a lot more resources. But also, given the type of year we had, it's making me wonder at times when we're going to have the ability to implement those fuels projects, given that we have fire for years now and we'll have resources committed to protecting communities. Do you see any chance that the future still will allow much of what, like you see behind me on this history map for the Bob Marshall Wilderness Complex, us continuing to manage fire for benefit using past fire events to manage them long term without or with less resources committed to them?
I think that's the path ahead, Mike, to be quite direct. Regardless of what you can call it anything you want, every fire we have always has a suppression strategy. That's one thing that gets lost. I think, unfortunately, it's too common for strategies that work to be caught up by people that don't understand the strategy or are fearful of the strategy, to try to force us to go back to a strategy that doesn't work. In many cases, the full perimeter control strategy often. So I mean, personally, to be honest, I think that's the path ahead in our 10-year plan. That's what we're talking about, is more fire on a landscape, more thinning, because we know we've got a much better chance of dealing with it on our terms than the fire's terms.
Okay. I think you've pretty much answered the question I'm going to read, but we'll see if you have anything more to add to that. From the chat, I'm wondering where gaps might exist moving forward, even with the new infrastructure legislation that still need to be urgently addressed, and some options for doing that.
Well, I think the largest gap that needs to be addressed is, you're not going to turn the ship overnight. So you can give an agency billions of dollars, but in the case of the Forest Service and the other federal agencies and most of our state agencies, right? The Forest Service lost 40% of its non-fire workforce since 2000. You don't replace that overnight. You don't pass a bill and say, here's money, go hire folks. And you don't you don't replace that overnight. And I'll use the state of Montana, for example. The Montana DNRC, at least several years ago, was putting about 150 firefighters into the state. The federal agencies about 1,000, right? So if the state of Montana is going to amp up their program, it's going to take them a while to do it. And it's going to take agencies and organizations and our partners a while to make those gaps. So I think we need to go into this eyes open and realize we didn't get here overnight. We're not going to get out of this overnight. It takes a while to turn the ship.
Very good. Thank you. There are more questions in the chat, but need to get moving on. And Bill has another meeting to get to. And so thank you, Bill, for joining us. And we'll continue moving onward.
All right.
And
Thanks,
if you
Mike.
get a chance to take a look at those questions in the chat while you're waiting for the other session to get going, maybe you can drop some answers in there. But thank you. And so we'll move on. Our third speaker is Matt Rance. And Matt began his fire management career in the early 2000s as a seasonal helitech firefighter for the province of Alberta. After joining Parks Canada in 2007, he held various fire and vegetation management roles in Banff, Yoho, Kootenay, and Wood Buffalo National Parks. He is currently the fire management officer in Waterton Lakes National Park. Matt has been a member of Parks Canada's National Incident Management Team since 2016 and currently fills the role of Operations Section Chief on Team Echo. He loves riding mountain bikes, skiing, cooking food, and attempting to grow things in the garden. He lives in wild and beautiful southwestern Alberta with his wife and 6-year-old son. So we'll turn it over to you, Matt, and I'll give you the same allowance of time, which is more, because it's been interesting, and hopefully that'll help us when we get to our story time later on. Thank you.
Hey, awesome. I'm going to try to share my screen here. This is the first time I've done one of these, so bear with me.
Yep, and at the bottom you should see like a green box with an arrow that says share screen. If you click that, it should pull up some options for you.
Okay.
Yep, awesome.
Okay. Yeah, so thanks. Okay, everyone, my name is Matt Rance. I'm the fire management officer here in Waterton Lakes National Park. And I'm going to share a little bit about our experience here during 2021, both at the park level, but also taking some cues from the regional and national levels. But before I get started, I just want to acknowledge that this presentation is coming to you from the present day territory of the Treaty 7 nations, which are the Blackfoot Confederacy nations of the Kainai, Piikani, Siksika, Amskapikani, as well as the Tsuut'ina Nation and Stoney Dakota. The Ktunaxa Nation and Métis Nation Region 3 Association also claim Waterton as being included within their traditional territory. The lands and waters of Waterton have been used for millennia by Indigenous people for sustenance, ceremony, trade, and travel. And we thank them for their continuous stewardship and for sharing the land with us. For those of you not already familiar with Waterton Lakes, here's just a regional map of the Crown with Waterton highlighted in yellow right there in the middle on the Canada-USA border, just to give you some context of where we are. The park covers about 500 square kilometers of transition from the high alpine to open fescue prairie. So what happened in Waterton? Started off pretty promising. We were able to pull off some low complexity burning in the Aspen Parkland ecoregion of the park in March. This was intended to be in preparation for a moderate to high complexity burn later in the spring, but the regional COVID situation forced us to cancel that operation, unfortunately. So really, the story of the summer in Waterton was one of extended periods of high to extreme fire danger, very low precipitation. June was 50% of the long-term average, and July was 4% of the long-term average. Record high temperatures, relative humidities in the single digits, high winds, regional smoke, fire bans, 3.5 months of continuous resource buildup, and one wildfire. And that wildfire we were able to catch pretty easily because it happened to be raining that day. Things might have been quite a bit more exciting if that tree had decided to fall on the power line during the previous windstorm when it didn't rain. But that's the what if game that fire management folks like to play all day long. So I won't waste everybody's time. Really, we devoted most of our energy this season to maintaining appropriate preparedness and response capacity and giving a lot of support to our partner agencies within Canada. So what happened in Canada? What happened in Western Canada? Obviously, as you gathered from the other two presentations, Waterton wasn't the only place that saw extreme conditions this summer. The low precip and heat waves of June and July were very widespread. And as the previous speakers mentioned, by the time mid-July rolled around, every province west of Quebec was reporting an agency preparedness level of 4 or 5. That's on a scale that goes to 5, similar to the US. So what that meant is that fire resources in much of the country were fully committed at home and unable to help out. Resource sharing in Canada, much like the United States, has a national coordinating body, CIFC, or the Canadian Interagency Forest Fire Center. And that system relies on the assumption that generally when one agency or one region is experiencing resource shortages due to a big fire year, one of the other large agencies has a bunch of board wet firefighters and incident management teams ready to go on export. But this year that got tested, particularly in June and July and early August. There was very, very little slack in the system. And as we've seen in the other presentations today, our friends in the United States were dealing with their own problems and weren't in a position to help us out. Eventually, personnel from Australia and Mexico were brought in, which was a huge relief to the crews and IMTs and people directly affected by these wildfire events. But I want to point out that it's not just the resources that CIFC coordinates, like crews, fire line equipment, and management teams that were in short supply. Everything else that goes along with that, all the contract resources like aircraft, contract crews, were super difficult to source. I experienced this both firsthand, both in Waterton from a preparedness and initial attack perspective. Intermediate helicopters, which we typically use to support our initial attack crews, were very, very difficult to come by in July. And also, while my incident management team was on deployment in the Kamloops Fire Center of British Columbia, we were managing a very large interface fire. And on this particular day, we'd requested some additional air assets to support a burnout operation in defense of a community. And my air operations branch director came to me after his conversation with the air desk and said, yeah, they asked me if this was for life or property. And I said, yeah. And I said, okay, is it threatened today or tomorrow? And he responded that it was hard to say, but tomorrow is more likely than today. And the person at the air desk just said, okay, well, let's chat tomorrow then. And that was pretty much the story of that incident. You know, being on a large fire surrounded by values that the fire's threatening to move into, and just not having the resources that you'd really like to have to manage that incident. So we did have to change tactics and strategy and really allow a large portions of that fire to burn freely, because we just did not have the resources to go after it. A few opportunities and lessons learned. So it's November, And the official reports and lessons learned from the 2021 fire season, they're still being written up. So I'm going to spitball here a little and throw out a few challenges and opportunities that I saw highlighted this season. It's not new stuff. I'm just going to be repeating some of the things that were brought up by the previous speakers. But it seems to be getting incrementally more intense each time we have a, air quotes, worst season ever. So the first one I'm going to throw out is there's opportunity to improve interoperability and resource sharing between fire management agencies, specifically within Canada, but also potentially looking at this at a broader scale. And what I mean by this is there could be a lot more standardized terminology, forms, and processes. Right now in Canada, each agency has its own tweaked version of the ICS planning process, incident action plans, and forms, which works great if everyone working on your incidents is from your own agency. But the future of fire management is going to involve more interagency resource sharing, not less. So we really need to put the work in to clear the deck of the silly things that can trip up a new incoming team or crew. CIFC's done some tremendous work on this over the last number of years, by the way. Full credit to them. They've created national standards for Type 1 crew members, leaders, various other positions, and I know that there's more in the hopper. But I also want to raise the importance of international resource sharing agreements, particularly with countries that we don't share a normal fire season with. That's going to become a lot more important looking forward into the future. There's been a lot of exchange between Australia and North America in recent years, and I'm expecting this is going to continue. So we should be working on strengthening those agreements and exchange. Something we saw a fair bit of this summer was residents who were under evacuation order not leaving or waiting until it's too late to leave. To be sure, my experience is that the vast majority of people leave when an evacuation order is issued, but there are often people who choose to stay to defend their property, either from a general lack of trust in government or awareness of the lack of resources, and some have no property insurance. Some have done a good job making their property defendable with sprinklers, large setbacks, irrigated fields to retreat to if something goes sideways. In other words, a pretty solid plan. Other folks that I've seen, not so much. Either way, this is something that adds quite a bit of complexity to an already dynamic scenario for firefighters and incident management teams. And it's something that's deserving of a far deeper dive than we have time for today. So it's a huge topic. And I know I have 10 minutes, so I'm gonna move on to the next one, which is mental health. How many times have you read the headline, "It was the worst fire season on record in X region in the last 5 years"? Like every year, right? And as the previous speakers have mentioned, they're not fire seasons anymore. They're fire years. I appreciate that. The seasons are getting longer, the deployments are getting more intense, and it's taking a toll on responders. People are leaving. I know personally that by the end of the season this year, between deployments and managing for response coverage into late October, I was pretty beat. The teams and local staff that I interacted with in BC in mid-July were exhausted. Some were going on to their third 2-week shift with 3 days off in between to sleep, hug their families, and do some laundry. And that's in July. I'm sure some of these teams ended up doing 5 or 6 pulls. These are not easy jobs. And as employers, we need to ensure that we're taking care of our staff, both from the perspective of giving them the tools and resources to do the job that we're asking them to do, but also taking care of them while they're on incident and when they get home. Within Parks Canada, we've started down the path of making mental health resources more available. including making CISM sessions standard for teams and crews to deploy out of agency or onto high complexity incidents within our own agency. Diversity and inclusion is going to be a huge piece of this as well. Very quickly, I'd like to plug the excellent new documentary film Anchor Point by Holly Tuckett, which explores some of the barriers facing women working in fire management. It's definitely worth your time. I'll drop a link to the film's webpage into the chat here in a few minutes when I'm off PowerPoint. And then the last point I'll raise is fire and Indigenous-led conservation. I'm going to be echoing a bunch here of what the previous speakers have said, but it bears it, and it's worth repeating. As people, as a society, we need to accept that fire has been part of this place for a long, long time. And we need to let go of the idea that this is a process that we can somehow exclude or control with more air tankers, more crews, more heavy equipment, particularly in the context of a warming planet. Not arguing that we shouldn't do everything we can to protect values during a wildfire emergency. I'm just saying that if we only invest in response capacity, it's never going to be enough. And we will be hurting the land by excluding the right kinds of fire. Proactive fuels treatments and wildfire risk reduction needs to see more investment. There's tremendous opportunity here for agencies and First Nations to support one another in reintroducing fire onto the landscape, reducing fuel accumulation around communities, and promoting healthy ecosystems. And that's what I've got for you folks. I know I went over, but I'd happily answer any questions now that you have.
All right. I entirely agree with you about the need to provide more of our resources to deal with things up front rather than simply responding to everything as an emergency and chaos. So one of the first questions I would ask is, as an operations section chief, over the last year, plus maybe you could add last year too, had you had any opportunities to manage fire events that that had prior fire on them across the landscape that you were able to use beneficially?
Yeah, 100%. The incident that I ended up on in British Columbia near Kamloops this season, yeah, we were very fortunate that one of the big runs that it made, it ended up making a 15 or 20 kilometer run in the middle of the night, jumping a wide river. And fortunately, on the other side of that river was a fire from 2009, and it ran right into that, and we did not have to worry about spread in that sector of the fire. So yeah, we're fortunate to have that.
Yeah, do you see that becoming more and more with more of the larger events? I mean, we have 2 gigafires now in the state of California, and I don't know how large the fires have been getting up in Canada, but do you see some of these larger past wildfire events that, even if they were detrimental to some communities, is offering some opportunity to do something now with those footprints on the landscape?
Yeah, anytime there's disturbance on the landscape, particularly a fire, either it was fire use or an older wildfire, it slows the fire down at the very least. One of the interesting things that I noticed this year was we were noticing that logging blocks of a particular age were holding the fire quite well. And then once they got, say, 30 to 40 years old, and the newer logging blocks, the ones that, and this is total conjecture on my part, so I'll preface that, but The newer ones, it seemed that they hadn't been burned, and there was quite a bit more surface fuel on the ground. And those logging blocks, you might as well have not had a disturbance there. The fire ripped right through them. But the older ones that had been burned, or we think were burned, 30 to 40 years ago, those held the fire quite well. And we were actually able to use those areas of regen to hold fire for a period.
Excellent. Yeah, I make a lot of biased anecdotal observations myself too when I'm out on the ground. So I appreciate that. Natalie, anyone with a hand up anywhere? I'm not seeing any questions in the chat right now.
Not seeing any hands.
Okay. So thank you, Matt. Appreciate. Oh, wait a second. Now they're coming in. Let me see if I can catch up with that. Okay, there are more statements. I'll let you go ahead and read some of those. Oh, here's one. In terms of the 2022 wildfire season, so the next fire season, what is your forecast for Waterton Lakes National Park and British Columbia?
That's a fun game. No, we prepare for it to be hot, dry, windy, with ignitions, and come November, we breathe a sigh of relief when it's not. We just get ready. I glance at the seasonal forecasts, but and there's the people who build them are very smart, but as an operational level person, you just have to plan for it to be bad, and you prepare to be ready, and you just take it as it comes. So I don't worry too much about that.
Okay. All right. So thank you, Matt. Appreciate that. We're gonna go ahead and hope you stick around. We're gonna go ahead and move on to the map of the crown of the continent for storytelling, and Phil Matson will be sharing that. Whenever you're ready to go, Phil. And one of the things we talked about doing with this storytelling, we're going to start off with a decade map here that Phil has. And Phil, do you want to talk about it real quick, or would you like me just to say general stuff?
Yeah, sure. I could talk about it a little bit.
Okay.
You can fill in the gaps for us. First of all, my name is Phil Matson. I'm a research coordinator with the Flathead Lake Biological Station, part of the University of Montana. I'm also the GIS database for the Crown Managers Partnership. We've been wanting to broach the subject of the fire for quite some time now. So we're really excited to not only have the fire forum this year, but this follow-up fire webinar. So thank you very much for joining us. This map that we're looking at right here just shows the last decade of fires throughout the crown of the continent. One of the big things that pops out to me right now is the big 2017 fires. Some of the previous speakers were talking about the hard work that takes place fighting these fires, dealing with them. They don't really look too big from this scale, at the scale of nearly 18 million acres. But when you're standing at the doorsteps of Flathead Lake, like we are, and then we compare some of these fires, like the Keenau, boy, they're really big, and it takes tremendous amount of effort. So my kudos to all those firefighters out there. The other thing that really stands out to me is the lack of fires, so it seems, in Alberta. Now, maybe I'm missing some Alberta data, but it just doesn't seem like a whole lot's going on there. So that's just one of the questions that jumped out to me. Anything for that, Mike?
Excellent. No, on the decade one you had, I didn't have a lot more to add to that. But those are some keen observations. Definitely. Yeah. Does anyone have anything they want to add to that?
So the average area of fires was 936 hectares. And we had about 340 of them throughout that decade. The maximum was 65,000 hectares, which was, I think it's the Rice Ridge one.
Oh, that's the one down on the
Rice
southwest.
Ridge right down there.
Exactly. So we have a little more, you have another map.
Yeah, so if we're done looking
2021.
at this guy, here's the 2021 map. The fire season started with the first natural fire with the Little Money Fire. And that's down on the southwestern portion of the Crown within the Confederate Station Kootenai Reservation. And that started in June 4th of this year with just over 26 hectares. Our largest fire altogether was ironically named the Greenhouse Fire over on the Blackfeet Nation. That was a human caused in some tall grass. And that started in late March, like Mike had talked about earlier, with 5,970 hectares.
And the thing that jumps out for me on this 2021 fire season, I look at the amount of fire events that occurred throughout the West and even to the East and up throughout Canada. And I look at the crown of the continent at 18 million acres or 7.2 million hectares. And that's not a whole lot of fire activity for what we were seeing across the West. It seems it was all, and in many ways, this is what I was essentially leading to when I was talking about I waited and waited. And on our 1 million acre district, almost 1 million acre district, we never had a smoke report. Not only not start, but not even a smoke report for any of our lookouts or any of our patrol flights that we took. And yet on the other half of our forest, which is outside the Crown, off to the southeast, we had 4 multiple fire campaigns going on with incident command teams, type 1s, handling them. And so it was really incredible to just see that we went by an entire season, almost to the end of September, until we got into hunting season, when bow season started. And then right away, within a 10-day period, we had 6 starts just like that. And we were able to catch most of them, but one of them in particular, the Crown Mountain Fire, which is, I'll have to have you point at it, Phil. It's now down to, yep, right there.
That guy right there.
That was one that we couldn't catch. And it's in an area that we have plans for burning 10,000 acres of just prescribed fire, a little bit of thinning, hand thinning with saws, and then ignition of it. And that fire to date is still burning. That's because that's how dry it is here on the east side. And we're still in fire restrictions today as a result of that. We have snow up high, but down low through the foothills, we are as dry as can be. So we've maintained our fire restrictions. So that fire there that was a person caused was $3 million to date. We're not doing a whole lot of action on it right now. It doesn't appear to be going anywhere. Compared to the fire further to the southwest, which is the Dry Cabin Fire. And that fire is 3,700 acres. And it started by lightning near the 1988 245,000 acre, what was that fire called? How could I forget it? Canyon Creek Fire. And we essentially took no action on that fire whatsoever. No boots on the ground, no helicopters with water drops, no retardant. We may have flown it 3 or 4 times because we knew that we had past fire events that were about 30 years old, 33 years old that we were able to use. And to this date, it's still burning, doing a lot of underburning and mature timber, but not much stand replacement. So it's actually doing a whole lot of good. And so and that fire cost 300,000 acres in terms of us just having to wrap cabins. We have a lot of administrative cabins in the wilderness, and we just protect them way ahead of time by wrapping them and putting sprinklers up. And so you're talking about $81 an acre versus $2,200 an acre with all that we had to do because we didn't have prior fire events to work with it. And hopefully we will once we get out of litigation with the project we have on the Rocky Mountain front. So any other fires that folks want to touch on? What's that one up there, Phil?
This is the Bill Nye fire, Bill Nye Mountain fire. This is the largest natural fire that we had this year caused by lightning. And that was 2,993 hectares. But I did also want to point out the little dots within Alberta. I couldn't get any up-to-date current fire perimeter data spatially downloadable from the Alberta government. So I had to go to NASA's website and look at some of their MODIS and their infrared data. So these red patches are actually point data that I had to blow up just to make them visible on the screen, because most of these are 1 acre or less. So just as a disclaimer there. And I believe they're all human caused, as far as I can cross-reference.
I'm just looking through the chat real quick. I see a question asking if you could explain the area of the 2017 wildfires on the first slide. So the decade.
Could I explain that? Well, the only one that I really am familiar with is the Keno fire in Waterton Glacier or Waterton National Park. I'm sure somebody like Matt Rance could explain that a little bit better, but I think that blew up pretty quickly and got out of control really fast. And like I mentioned earlier, the other one I'm really familiar with is the Rice Ridge.
And that was lightning caused, I believe.
Yes, I believe it was.
Yep.
Sorry, I can't explain that anymore.
Right.
I am personally not a fire guy. I work in the water realm, battling aquatic invasive species, but I do jump on board to the terrestrial realm doing the GIS work. So another disclaimer there.
All right. So any stories folks want to share of any fire events that occurred in 2021? Oh, here we go. Go ahead, Ron.
Back to that 2017, that Rice Ridge fire there, that was right around the community of Seeley Lake. Several incident management teams on it. And one night it made a significant, like 60,000 acre run. It was really starting to gain some strength. And the fire just to its off the corner there to the southwest, that's the Liberty fire, a fire that was in our Southport primitive area, one that I mentioned. Most of that fire perimeter burnt in one large run back down to the south off the reservation into TNC land and Bureau of Land Management land and Forest Service land. And since then, we've done some collaborating with those folks. We're starting to do fuels treatments in that area, just one to enhance some cultural significant areas that we have there for our tribes through the RTRL authority, and also to help enhance that catcher's mitt if we do have more fires that head that direction. We're working with Stephen Ketzel, TNC, and Michael Albritton and Hancock out of the BLM station doing some work in that area. And that RTRL authority, now that the Bureau of Indian Affairs is pushing forward, is really looking at trying to do work on boundaries where fires have a tendency to transition or culturally significant areas for the tribes. So it's just an authority that we do have. I don't see the Black fire on here, but that was another fire in 2017 that would have been directly north of the Liberty fire, and one that we had in the Mission Mountain wilderness that luckily burnt into the 2007 Jocko Lakes fire, because it had the potential to come back position itself north of Sealy and then come back down that canyon. And that's always been the fear that that community has, and some discussion we've had with the Lolo National Forest, is that the next fire that would come down and impact that community is probably going to come north of it, get positioned, and then come down canyon. But yeah, that's definitely those fires.
Thank you for that, Ron. We're going to bring the story time to a close here, because we are approaching 1:30, if not already past it, and bring this session or webinar to a close. We really appreciate the folks that participated, and we're hoping that this met the needs of what folks were asking for as participants during the March 21 fire forum, to hear more about what happened. And that's mainly what folks wanted to look at. You know, our forum actually looked at a lot more research, a lot more integration of practitioners and research things that were happening across the sea of the crown of the continent. This one was more about what did actually end up happening through the 21 season. And I have to say that when I look at the larger area beyond the crown, I often wonder if we're making a big enough difference in what we're trying to do. And I just wonder, are we ever going to get to the point where we're going to be able to have society realize that fire is a keystone ecological process, no different than we look at keystone species like whitebark pine or keystone species like grizzly bears, but even much bigger. Fire is not subservient to timber management or to other activities. It is the keystone process, and in many ways, it's the creator of a living landscape. And I hope that as we continue to move forward, even as we're dealing with climate change, that we can help folks see better the creator's technologies or natural processes and things that we need to adapt to, so that we can move beyond always starting some of our storytelling with the 1910s. We didn't do that here, but a lot of the webinars or series that I get to read on or look at always talk about 1910, and it's always about the devastation. And there has been no doubt about that, to the folks that have lost homes and entire communities that have been wiped out. But there's still something more to fire, and it's given us what we have today. And I hope that we can continue to work at it through our channels, such as the Crown Managers Partnerships and others as well, and that we can have more research and practitioners that help focus on wildfire and its benefits to the landscape. So thank you for sharing your time with us. Appreciate it, and look forward to you continuing to work on it. Bye-bye.